This has been fantastic, and I'm so excited about our next speaker. Danesha Seth Carley. Dr. Carley is another one of our phenomenal faculty members here at NC State University. She's a colleague of Bill and I in the Department of Horticultural Science, and she is the director of the Center for Integrated Pest Management here. Her research and outreach programs for sustainable managed landscapes focus on pollinator protection and habitat conservation, just like what Basil was talking about. She's worked on the restoration of historic Pinehurst No. 2 and Pinehurst No. 4 golf courses. And she just recently completed a book called Pollinator Gardening for the South, Creating Sustainable Habitats. It will be out and available in March, but it is available for pre-order now through the University of North Carolina Press. And we are going to have Danesha and her co-author, Ann Spaffer, back out here again, hopefully in person, to talk about that book. But right now, I want to turn it over to Dr. Seth Carley to talk about pollinator gardening, how to plan, plant, and maintain successful and beautiful pollinator gardens.
Oh, thank you so much, Mark, for that really warm introduction, and good morning to everyone. I am so pleased to have the time to talk with you today about one of my very, very favorite things in the world, and that's gardening and pollinators. And I can't think of a better thing to do on a beautiful day in February, other than maybe stay home with a cup of tea and browse through my gardening books. But hopefully we'll inspire you to do that after you guys get off of our meeting today. So thank you for having me. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and jump right in. My talk is about pollinator gardening, and I'm going to talk a lot about planting and planting. I don't think I'm going to have time to get to the maintaining part, but we can certainly answer some of your maintenance questions at the end. And without further ado, I'll jump right on in. So if we were in person, I would ask for a show of hands. How many of you can tell me how many of the pictures that I have here on the screen are in fact pollinators? Fantastic. People are raising their hands. So if you raised your hand, would you say that all of them are in fact pollinators? All right. If you did, then you would be right. We often talk about bees when we talk about pollinators. And in fact, I would say the most common bee people would think of would be the honeybee, which you can see in the top left corner of my slide. A lot of people might mention butterflies. And while they are pollinators, technically, they don't make terribly efficient pollinators. But the second most efficient group of insects that are pollinators are actually flies. And I'm not going to talk much about flies and not really much about butterflies because bees are sort of in my wheelhouse. And so I tend to lean into the bee pollinator habitat. But I will tell you that anything you see here on this slide is actually a pollinator. We know very little actually about beetles and how they pollinate, but technically my dog walking through my garden could be called a pollinator. Anything that moves pollen from one thing to another is a pollinator. Again, today, we're mostly going to be talking about bees, a little bit about butterflies, and maybe birds. But if you have questions later about specific bees or birds or even lizards, feel free to drop them in the chat. So most people understand that bees are terribly important for not only agriculture, but also the beauty of our landscapes around us. And the most important pollinator, especially in terms of agriculture, is the Western honeybee. The honeybees actually benefit our agricultural system. Some people say they would contribute 1 out of every 3 bites of food to the honeybee. But native bees, which are also important and actually help a lot of agricultural crops that we don't think about, that honeybees cannot pollinate, are also terribly important. And in fact, when native pollinators are not available in the ecosystem or in the environment to service crops, honeybees actually contribute $8.3 billion to our economy. And oftentimes we think of honeybees in hives in someone's backyard or perhaps their side yard, But there is actually a very large industry that put honeybee hives on tractor trailers and go all the way from Florida in the early spring, all the way up the coast through the Carolinas, up to Maine, and then across our great nation, all the way to California, so that those bees can sit in different agricultural crops in the fields and pollinate those fields. So you can imagine in the South, we have cucurbits that need to be pollinated, and sometimes we have solanaceous crops. And then as you move up the coast, blueberries and cranberries, across the Midwest, all the way out to California for those almond fields. And so honeybees are indeed agriculturally perhaps the most important pollinator, but I want to stress that native bees are of equal value, if not more, in our home landscapes. So this is a picture, you may have seen some iteration of this slide at other times. As a quilter, I really love this slide. I did not take these photographs, I borrowed them from the internet, but you can see on the left-hand side, we have a beautifully balanced breakfast. And this is what bees help to contribute to our food system. We need them for apples, for berries, for the nuts in our granola, for the oranges that make our orange juice. Sadly, without bees, our breakfast would be quite dull, and we would have none of those really healthy fruits and vegetables to contribute to our breakfast and our nutrition. So again, bees, very important, especially if you like to eat. You've also probably heard, if you read the news or listen to the radio, that there are populations in decline. Mostly, again, we're talking about honeybees because they're managed, and we can actually count the number of bees in our hives and estimate how many are alive and how many are dead. And those numbers can sound quite staggering and can be quite alarming. But our native bees, again, less well studied, but equally important, if not more so in certain systems, are also in decline. What's causing that decline, you might ask? Well, I'm going to tell you. You can see from my little pie chart here, and this is not representative of the percentage of each of these different challenges for the bees. It's just simply to demonstrate that the entire bee populations, whether they're native or managed bees, are in decline for a number of factors, including diseases and pests that you may have heard of. Climate change definitely impacts bees and bee populations. And of course, as Basil and I believe Bill both mentioned, the misuse or use of chemicals that directly impact or indirectly impact bee populations as well. Now, I skipped the first bullet point in my talk just a second ago, but I'm going to come back to that one now. Another factor that contributes to the loss of pollinators is actually a loss of their feeding and nesting sites. The nice thing about that, and that's why I have it here highlighted, is that that is something that we as individuals can make a very big impact on for our bees, our butterflies, our birds, and our other wildlife. So that's what we're mostly going to talk about today. So the really nice thing is that if you live in a city, you might think that your pollinator habitat doesn't have an influence or an impact on pollinator populations, but in fact, it really does. There's been some really wonderful research, some of which has come out of NC State even, that demonstrates very clearly that bees do very, very well in suburbs and cities. And if you think about that, it might actually make sense. Think about what you plant in your yard, or as you drive around, think about the diversity of plants that we have. Because we're humans, we by nature like diversity. Think about the J.C. Ralston Arboretum and the incredible biodiversity we have just in that area, right here in the heart of Raleigh. Because we like to plant a diversity of plants in our yards, we are also bringing a diversity of pollinators and wildlife, insects primarily, but also birds, to our communities. So those are really important habitats for our pollinators that we would like to protect. For the most part, pollinators do quite well in cities, especially if many people are planting areas where they can fly around and find forage and survive. I have a little star here. Pollinators do fine in the city. The only caveat to that is, of course, there can be heat island effects. The more pavement or asphalt you have in an area, the higher the temperature, and that can contribute as well to pollinator decline. But those are also areas that don't grow plants particularly well. So consider that as you're working in your yard. You want to think about that heat island effect and maybe plant away from your large cement areas. Bees also help feed people, so make room for flowers. Whether you have an urban garden, a community garden, or just a small garden in your front or backyard, those gardens can help contribute to increasing pollinator populations, which also help to increase the bountiful yields for our growing community and urban gardens. And Bill said it earlier, if you build it, they will come. If you add pollinator habitat to anywhere that is appropriate for those bees and those plants, then your bees will be happier and healthier and your plants will be more productive. So now we're going to start getting into the nitty-gritty about how to design and plan your pollinator garden. Some of these tips are appropriate if you are just new to gardening and are just starting to think about how you would like to build your garden or design a new garden. And many of these tips can also be attributed to gardens that are already established and you'd like to renovate or add to. So the first thing you want to think about is, how would you plan a healthy meal for your family? You do the same thing for pollinators when you're planning pollinator habitat. You want variety, meaning you don't want to have the same plant in huge swaths of area. You want to plant a biodiverse garden. You want multiple layers or texture in your garden, just like you would have in a healthy meal. Now, we often think about seasonality in our gardens, but we also think about it when we're eating. What's seasonal now? Making sure that when you're picking plants for your garden, you're having plants that bloom as much as possible, as long as possible, both in the beginning of the spring, all the way through the summer and into the late fall, because bees are going to need habitat and forage during the spring when they're coming out, through the summer and through the fall. A lot like how I plan my meals at home. I go to the farmer's market, I see what's available and seasonal, I go home and I plan a meal. Now this last one doesn't quite fit with the meal plan, but think about groupings. When you're planting your garden, you want to think about multiple plants in one area so that you have clumps of plants, which not only look prettier from a design standpoint, but also help bees. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. So you see here in this picture, I've demonstrated the clumping of plants or grouping. In the scientific community, we just call this floral constancy. And all that means is that you see here the blanket flower or gaillardia in the foreground, that bright orange with just a tinge of yellow. That is actually 5 different gaillardia plants that have all been grouped together. That actually helps bees, some kinds of bees, not all are the same. But in the case of honeybees, for example, they prefer what's called floral constancy. That means that when they go out on foraging trips, they prefer to forage on a single flower type when they are collecting their pollen or nectar, depending on what they're out for that day. There are other bees that are generalists. Bumblebees are a great example. They don't care what they're landing on or where it is. They'll just flip from plant to plant to plant gathering pollen. But honeybees prefer floral constancy. So that's why when you see honey in the grocery store that says sourwood honey, that means that those bees that day went out and only collected pollen or nectar from sourwood trees. And we know that they've done that because they prefer to forage off of those same plants. Again, there are plenty of bees that don't do that. So just have as much variety as you can for your bees. Something else we like to recommend is, especially if you're a new gardener, carry a journal. I have mine with me. I was just looking for it. I carry a journal with me so that I can keep records of the dates that I'm noticing things blooming, especially at this time of year. I love to write down what's the first thing I've seen in my neighborhood that's blooming and the first bees or butterflies I see in the environment. That can help you when you're thinking about adding to your garden or even starting fresh, that gives you that seasonality. It helps you plant plants that are going to bring the bees earlier and earlier. And that helps, again, the bees' long-term population health. And no matter what your neighbors are planting or what the garden club says is the hot new flower of the year, don't be afraid to try new plants. Go ahead and be different. The bees are going to love you for it. One caveat again to that is just making sure if you're going to kind of break out of the mold and go off on your own on choosing plants, just make sure that the plants that you're choosing are not considered invasive in your area, because we would never want to encourage you to plant invasive plants, because that's not good for you, for your gardens, and ultimately not good for your bees. So something else that bees need is a home, just like we do. We don't think about that a lot unless you think about honeybees. We all know honeybees live in hives. But what about all those other bees? Basil mentioned there are actually over 500 native bees just in North Carolina alone. And in fact, North Carolina is unique to the South in that we have one of the most diverse populations of native bees in the entire nation. So we need to make sure that we're having places that those bees can live and live comfortably. One of my favorite projects to do with kids or with scouting groups is to build our very own insect hotel. It's very, very easy. There are some wonderful plans online. Essentially, you can just go into your environment and forage for some logs and some bricks and some twigs and some sticks and hollowed grasses, and you just bundle them all together. There's no right or wrong way to do it. However, and I know we were talking a lot about mulch earlier, something to really consider if you're leaning into this pollinator gardening is that pollinators cannot live in heavy mulch. So I'm going to take a step back and mention something that I forgot to mention earlier, and that is when we think about bees, we think about honeybee hives, and that's fine for honeybees, but all the other bees don't live in hives. For the most part, and you can see it demonstrated here in my slide, they either live in hollowed out twigs or stems of grasses, such as switchgrass that are still in your yard. They, in some cases, even dig holes in your yard. They're not actually destroying the grass, although it really does feel like they are. They like those warm, sunny patches that are already fairly bare, and they burrow into the ground. So a lot of our native bees are using the environment in your garden and around your garden to build their homes, to plant their nests, so to speak. And so if you're heavily mulching your large areas, then those bees can't get through the mulch to build their homes. And we would never recommend using plastic in your landscape. Not only is it environmentally not friendly, but it also will smother the bees that are already there, but also won't allow your bees to nest in your ground. Don't forget the grasses and stems in your garden hotel, your bee hotel. As I mentioned, you want those hollow twigs. Bamboo works very nicely. And then again, hollow grass stems from warm season grasses work really well in these insect hotels. So this is something I talk a lot about, and I'm going to start with this. I cut my teeth in turf grass, and that's how I actually got into pollinator habitat, was because so many golf courses that I worked with were very, very good at growing grass, but they really wanted to spend more of their area protecting wildlife and bees. And so someone needed to become an expert on those, what we call out of play areas on turf areas or on golf courses. So think about those areas outside of golf courses that you see that may look messy or weedy. Those are actually really wonderful areas for pollinators and other wildlife. The same can be said of your yard. This is something that some people really appreciate me saying. Maybe if you don't like mowing your yard, you should just let the weeds take over. And then you can just tell your neighbor or whomever asks why you've stopped mowing your yard. You can just say, well, I'm protecting bees. And let me give you a few things that you can mention. First of all, this is a picture, this is a close-up of my yard. We don't do a lot of mowing in my yard either. And so some of the most important pollinator forage early on in the year are indeed found right here in my weedy lawn. Dandelions are extremely important, especially early in the spring. You often see them. In fact, just yesterday I was walking the dogs in my neighborhood and I started to see dandelions blooming. Stop thinking of them as weeds. Start thinking of them as baby bee food. Mother bees, which are all the bees that you see, are all female. They're all the workers. They go out and they're collecting, in this case, they're collecting dandelion pollen in the spring. They bring it back to feed their baby bees. So again, dandelions aren't weeds, they're baby bee food. And right now I'm going to tell you the secret of the very best bee food that you can have in your whole yard. And that is in fact white clover. Bees get a tremendous amount of nectar that they need for energy, and they get it from these white clover. The other nice thing about white clover, if you've ever seen it, you've noticed it doesn't grow terribly high. So I would never recommend that people let their lawns grow out of control. You might get in trouble with your homeowners association, but if you are letting some areas grow a little bit wild and go native, white clover is actually a really nice plant to have. They're also nitrogen fixers, which I know that Bill would be approving of because they add nitrogen into your soil, so they increase soil health as well. One thing to remember about white clover, though, is it doesn't like high traffic and it doesn't do terribly well in droughty periods. So what I recommend for folks who aren't 100% ready to let their whole lawn go to clover and dandelions is just maybe set aside a little sunny area that you stop mowing and just see what comes up. And then again, when you see dandelions and clover, remember they're not weeds, they're bee food. Seasonality, I mentioned this earlier, is also very, very important. I'm not going to spend too much time on it on this slide because in a moment I'm going to show you about 7 slides. So you're going to want to get your garden notebook out. I'm going to show you 7 slides with my favorite and the best pollinator plants that we can have in our landscape here in North Carolina. And actually most of these plants are also very appropriate for the Atlantic area and the Midwest and even all the way as far as California, because I know we have folks on here from all over the US. So when we're thinking about seasonality, as a designer, my partner Ann Spafford would say, you want to think about seasonality because you want your garden to be beautiful at all times of the year. And of course that's true, but Ann's a landscape designer, so she's coming at it from sort of that artistic standpoint. In terms of bee habitat, I want to make sure that I'm encouraging people to plant plants that are blooming and providing not just nectar for energy for bees, carbohydrates, right? Just like with humans, we need that energy, those carbs to get us going. But bees also need pollen, which they feed their young, and that's the protein. So I always like to say that, you know, bees can't get enough carbohydrates. They've never been on the South Beach diet. Honeybees and some native bees will actually collect nectar and pollen and combine it together to form what's called a bee loaf. And again, they're feeding their baby bees with that. You want to choose plants when you're selecting them for your bee landscape that provide both pollen and nectar. And believe it or not, some plants provide some pollen, but not nectar, and some plants do a better job providing nectar and very little pollen. Now we're going to talk a little bit about design. So I'm sort of out of my comfort zone here a little bit, but what I will tell you is that if you're new to gardening or you have a new area in your yard that you'd like to convert to maybe away from lawn, or you have an old garden you'd like to renovate and turn into a new pollinator garden, you can go online and just type in garden design. And you're going to find that there are hundreds of ideas about garden design that you can find on the internet. There is no right or wrong way to design a pollinator garden. So find one that speaks to you and that you really appreciate and enjoy and feel like you can tackle, and just go with that. If you aren't inclined to go online and get overwhelmed by the thousands of beautiful design gardens that might be out there, some things to think about that you might not have considered before are these. That is, that instead of going to a big box store or to your favorite native plant nursery or even to your gardening handbooks or guides to buy your plants, before you select your plants, when you're designing a garden, the best thing to do first is to think about how much light your site has, because the amount of sunlight, of course, is very, very important. And almost all the plants I'm going to talk about in just a moment are full sun or high sun area plants. The other thing you want to think about is form. Do you want big trees? Do you want shrubs? Do you want everything to be low growing? And again, a designer would recommend that you have all those different layers so that you have a more beautiful design, more pleasing to the eye. And you want to think about the colors you might want in your garden. And only after you have thought about all those things do you go and pick your plants. Now, I've told you the right way to do it, and now I'm going to tell you the way I do it. In the spring, I get so fed up with the cold and the rain and the snow that the first sign of spring, I run out to my favorite nursery and I buy all the plants that I want, and then I bring them home, and then I plant them in my yard. I call that the yes, please form of gardening. Again, my co-author, Ann Spafford, usually just shakes her head when I tell her about my style. But I'm telling you that because I just want you to know that there's no right or wrong way to design your garden if you have the right elements in it. Just a few other things to consider, and you can get a little artsy with this if you want. Pollinators, like people, have three basic needs. They need space, and we talked a little bit about that earlier, right? Go light on the mulch if you need mulched areas, and no plastic in your landscape. They need food, and we've talked about that, and we're going to talk about more about that in a moment. But also, just checking my time. Also, it can be nice to add a water element to your yard, and especially if you are a honeybee hive owner or have a lot of bees in your landscape. Something the bees especially appreciate is a little place to dip their toes in and to drink some water. Now, I know in the South and part of the Southwest and probably even up north, the first thing that you're going to think of is, well, I don't want standing water in my yard, because what do you get? Mosquitoes. Nobody wants mosquitoes. And I'm a big fan of creatures great and small, and even I don't care for mosquitoes. So what I can tell you is that we've thought of a few strategies that are demonstrated on the slide here to allow you to add a gentle water element to your yard, but will also discourage mosquitoes. I'm not going to spend too much time on these because I don't have a lot of time left, and I have so much more I want to tell you. But something I like to do with my old wine bottles, flip them upside down, stick them in my garden. Not only are they pretty and it's recycling, but you can see the little divot, because I buy cheap wine, I don't buy the high-end stuff. You can see the little divot here in the wine bottle that will collect ever so small amounts of water, but not enough to encourage mosquitoes. Just enough for the bees, in fact. You can use plants with big leaves like this one here in the lower right corner that actually will collect water. And not only is that really beautiful and attractive, but again, doesn't encourage mosquitoes, but will still allow that water element in your garden. And of course, the nice good old fashioned plant bottom that you can get at any big box store, or you might even have in your backyard or gardening shed. Put some stones in it, add some water, instant water element.
Hey, Danesha?
Yes,
Danesha?
sir.
I just wanted to come in. We started with you a little bit late, so don't try, and we've got plenty of time for Q&A at the end. I don't want you to short shrift our attendees at all, so don't sweat about that, okay?
Oh, thank you, Mark. But if you do at any point need to jump in and cut me off, which you might have to do, don't hesitate to do that. But thank you very much. I won't rush through to get done at 11:20 right on the button. Thank you.
Thank you.
One last word about design. Oops. Sorry, y'all. I got too excited about going right on. One last thing to consider about design, and there are so many things, as I said, and design is not my wheelhouse. That's why you co-author with someone whose wheelhouse it's in. But something else from the bee standpoint is that, you know, we always say size matters. And in this case, what we're really talking about is tongue length. You probably don't know or care about different lengths of tongues on bees, but I will tell you that in fact, some bees are long-tongued and some bees are short-tongued. And so if you have a favorite pollinator or type of pollinator that you would really like to attract to your garden, that's something that might influence your design and the plants that you select for your garden. For example, long-tongued bees like bumblebees, which are also native bees, and we have so many beautiful, wonderful bumblebees in our environment, especially here in North Carolina. Bumblebees are long-tongued bees. So think about plants that have, or flowers, excuse me, that have a tubular or trumpet shape to them. A few examples here I'm using are snapdragons or columbine. These are going to be more often frequented by bumblebees and other native bees that have long tongues. And it makes sense, right? The nectar that they're going for are way down in the bottom of this tube, and so they have to land on it. And if they're too big to crawl in, then they have to use their long tongue to access that nectar. Short-tongued bees, and in fact flies and beetles also fall in this category, prefer what we call open face flowers. And I have 3 examples of those right here. And I'll just mention I did in fact take all these pictures, and I use that as a great excuse to get outside on days I'm just tired of sitting at my desk. So we have the purple coneflower here at the top. We have the beautiful annual cosmos here, the orange one in the middle. And then down on the bottom, we have that gaillardia or blanket flower that I mentioned earlier. All of those make wonderful bee habitat. And they are most, well, here you can see they're all being frequented by a honeybee, but any small native bee would also prefer these open face flowers. All right, now's the time for everyone to get their pen out and their garden notebook and be ready to take some notes. I'm not going to stop on any of these slides for a terribly long period of time. I know that Mark said that he would make these slides available, so you're welcome to refer back to the slides after the presentation. And also I have a very small handout with just sort of a quick cheat sheet of my 10 favorite pollinator plants. And so be sure that you visit that handout or ask to receive it if you haven't yet, so that you know my very favorite pollinator plants in our landscape. But I am going to go through a few of my favorites. And because people always say, well, what are your top 5 favorites? It's so hard to pick my top 5 favorite plants, because are they my top 5 favorite plants in the spring? Are they my top 5 annual plants? Are they my top 5 plants that host caterpillars? I can't pick 5. It's like picking a favorite child. Although to be fair, I do have a favorite child. But my son is an only child, so I'm allowed to make that joke. Okay. So in the springtime, one of the very first plants that we have blooming that offer habitat and forage for our native early pollinators and honeybees, if they're in the area, are what are called Zizia golden Alexanders. And they're actually shown in both of these pictures that aren't the Aquilegia, the columbine. They're that yellow flower. And that I'll mention that the golden Alexanders are not only one of the earliest plants that we have that come out and bloom here in North Carolina, they're also a native plant, and they make a wonderful host, as you can see, for swallowtail caterpillars. Now, a word about host plants, and I don't talk much about that later in the talk, but I will mention now that if you're planting plants for host plants, typically for caterpillars, please be aware that when you plant those plants, they are going to be defoliated. What do caterpillars eat? Anybody? Anybody? They eat the leaves of your plants. So if you want to put in plants that are going to be host plants for those caterpillars, I totally commend that. And that's a wonderful thing to do. Most years I put in dill, and I just say that it's for the caterpillars because I don't harvest any. They just get eaten by the caterpillars. So keep that in mind. And if you're going to plant the golden Alexanders, you probably will in fact get swallowtail larvae caterpillars on your golden Alexander. So plant quite a few, and that way you can share. They also make really beautiful combinations if you're thinking artistically and about colors. You can see here that the golden Alexanders are mixed with the red yarrow and the lance leaf blanket flower. This will be later in the season, of course, because right now yarrow and blanket flower are not going to be blooming. Another early bloomer is the native wild columbine. I have a ton of this in my yard. If anyone wants some, I am putting out the call to you right now. You are welcome to some of my eastern wild columbine. I have tons in my yard, and it's a beautiful, hardy native and an early bloomer. So again, we talk about seasonality. We want to have things that can bloom early spring, mid-spring, late spring, summer, fall, late fall, as much opportunity for those bees to be foraging and surviving and thriving as we can have. So one of my late spring that will carry into the summer favorites is Asclepias. Any species, you pick one, they're all wonderful. They don't all do well, particularly in certain areas. Some of them need good drainage in their soil. Some of them don't care. Some can transplant well, some seed well. Really, any way you can get the Asclepias into your yard, I would say make sure you're planting them. One of the things that Asclepias offer for pollinators is the nectar. And that nectar is especially good for honeybees and other native bees. But if you're a big honeybee fan, this is one of the best flowers. And of course, this Asclepias tuberosa, the orange one here that's featured, is actually called butterfly weed because it's a tremendous butterfly pollinator plant. And so if you plant these, you will get butterflies. They like that nectar a lot. So late spring, summer, these will even bloom into fall. The Gaillardia, you've heard me mention a few times, blanket flower or lance leaf blanket flower, prairie Gaillardia. There are a number of different species. They all grow very, very well in North Carolina, as well as south of here, a little bit north of here and west of here, all the way out to California, in fact. They are also really nice in your environment, particularly if you're at the coast or in the sandhills, because they tolerate hot and dry conditions. And in my opinion, in all the years I've been doing pollinator research, these are some of the easiest flowers to establish. Whether you're buying it from seed or you're buying them in pots and planting them, they are perennials. Sometimes they grow as annuals, but they reseed very nicely. This is a really easy plant to grow. I think it's high impact because of the color. And you can see here it's beloved by bees and butterflies alike. Continuing late spring, summer into fall. Another one of my very, very favorites is the Echinacea, a purple coneflower. They're, of course, native types as well as bred cultivars. You can see an orange one here, one of my favorites. Actually, I think that picture was the cover of our book. Rudbeckia is also a very nice one, seen here in yellow, also called black-eyed Susans. And then not a native plant, but an herbaceous plant that can be quite useful not only in cooking, but also provides nectar and pollen all the way from summer into the fall is this borage. It can be a really lovely plant to include, and that really bright blue flower makes it a eye-popping color in your garden. So late into summer, there are a lot of choices. Here are a few favorites. I know that the Stokes aster is a favorite here in North Carolina. The agastache, which grows tall and skinny. I often see all types of bees, wasps, beetles, butterflies, flies on the agastache in our garden, sometimes all at the same time. I don't think that it's often thought of as eye-catching, but for me, when it's in full bloom and it has all those pollinators on it, I can't take my eyes off it. Walker's mint, catmint, butterflies especially really like that, but bees of all types like it as well. Again, it's an exotic, not a native. And then Mark mentioned earlier the pycnanthum, the mountain mint, is a little white flower, but it gets tall and bushy. And it's also a really beautiful native that we grow here that bees of all types love. It's also really hard to kill. I have a patch of that in my yard, And my chickens have managed to kill everything in that little herb garden except for my mountain mint, which has just resisted the attack of my hens. Moving summer into fall, Rudbeckia, as I already mentioned, the brown-eyed Susan or black-eyed Susan, Monarda, which is bee balm. You can get it in a variety of different colors. If you're planting Monarda, you want to make sure you're planting it in a high sun area. It is prone to getting leaf diseases, and the reason they get them is if there's too much shade or too much moisture on their leaves. So those are going to benefit from those high sun areas. And then the sunflower is hard to pass up, right? Sunflowers of all different types can be grown as annuals. You can grow them in pots. You can seed them around your mailbox, in your garden. They're just beautiful, and sunflowers just make me happy. So I would encourage you to plant sunflowers. Summer into fall. Again, asters are one of my favorites. You can get so many types and so many colors. They mound up. Some can be short mounders. Some can get quite tall. So make sure that when you're picking an aster, which I highly recommend that you add to your garden because it brings bees and pollinators of all types to your yard, I would encourage you to make sure that you're paying very careful attention to how tall those might get. Again, they're mounders, but asters are one of my very favorite late summer into fall pollinator species. And goldenrod actually, it makes a really nice partner when you're thinking about design. It blooms at the same time as these asters, and so you can have these really bright purple or bright blue asters, and then you can have the solidago or goldenrod in the foreground. Also another wonderful pollinator plant. Joe pieweed and ironweed. You know, I grew up on a farm, and we had these, we considered them weeds in our horse pasture, but now, and they can grow quite tall, sometimes 6 or 7 feet tall, and they might be quite unruly for a garden. But there are now varieties that you can find that are quite short in stature, and so that's something to think about. These are really nice because they're really late summer, fall bloomers where you don't often have a lot of other things still blooming in your garden. One of my other favorites, and this is in the sunflower family, these are helianthus. These are also native to North Carolina. They do well in wet areas. But one thing to remember about these plants is they do get very, very tall. So if you're planting them, make sure that they have something to lean on, like a fence, or that you plant them in the back of your yard or back of the garden so that they're not overwhelming the foreground of your beautifully designed pollinator garden. I'm going to go quite rapidly now through the last couple of my plant slides. I just have 2 more, maybe 3 more recommendations for plant slides, but I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. I don't think that it would be fair of me not to talk about trees and shrubs, since I just had Basil on here talking about the importance of trees, and I couldn't agree more. So some of our North Carolina native trees and shrubs make the absolute best forage, especially early in the spring. So eastern redbud, and you see them here in green, and the red maple are 2 of the earliest bloomers in our landscape in North Carolina. They're very, very important for those early pollinators that are trying to brave the cold and come out. Other excellent trees and shrubs that you might consider adding to your landscape are here, including sourwood, sumac, and tulip poplar. Again, depending on your landscape or the area that you have. Some of our native shrubs are wonderful. I apologize, I cut this word honey off. I don't know how that happened. Clethra is one of my very favorites. It has those really nice dark green leathery leaves and the really beautiful spikes of flowers. The bees just love it because it's loaded with nectar. All right, my top 5 favorite plants. Everyone always asks me this. Again, I've already prefaced it with, how can you pick your top 5 favorites? They're all wonderful. But if I were just recommending 5 plants for your yard because you wanted to start a pollinator garden, but you wanted to make sure that you had time to manage it, maintain it, and water it, which is all very important, not just the planting, right? You can't just quit after you put it in the ground. These would be my top 5 favorites. But this is in the handout, so I'm going to keep moving. And I've already talked about all of them. They're all Just beautiful. Okay, just a few last things to consider. Remember, more diversity of plants in your landscape means a more diversity of pollinators in your landscape. You want plants that bloom early spring all the way into late fall if you have the chance, the opportunity, and the space to do that. Something to consider is though hybrid flowers can be really, really beautiful in your landscape. Dahlias are a great example. They're just stunning and they can be, you know, dinner plate sized, and they're definitely showstoppers. But those plants with the doubled flowers do not make good pollinator habitat or forage. And that's in part because the way that they're bred, often those stamens that were supposed to produce pollen have actually been bred to actually produce petals. And so they don't produce a lot of pollen. And what little pollen they do produce is really hard for the bees to get to. So if you're leaning into that pollinator habitat, maybe skip those beautiful dinner plate sized dahlias and reach for an echinacea instead. Don't forget larval host plants if you don't mind a little frass and some caterpillars in your yard. As I mentioned, ZZ is a great one. Herbs make really wonderful pollinator habitat, as does milkweed, for those host plants for caterpillars. Provide some nesting structures. You might plant some warm season grasses. Grasses, of course, are not fed on by pollinators, but they are used as habitat. So maybe grab a switchgrass or a blue stem and plant that in your yard as well. And then last but not least, we recommend if you're trying to plant for pollinators, we would encourage you not to use pesticides or herbicides of any kind in your yard. I'm not anti-pesticide as a rule, but when you're planting for your family, for your pollinators, you want them to be as healthy and safe as possible. So it's just best to skip those pesticides. And I believe Basil mentioned that as well. So in closing, no matter what your yard looks like, no matter what size area you have, no matter how crazy or how many things you want to add to your area and your habitat, or how small, there's no garden too small or landscape too large to include pollinator habitat. Together, we can help protect our pollinator friends, and maybe we can inspire someone else to do it with us along the way. So last but not least, my very favorite part of the talk is that our publishers have agreed to allow us to give out 3 advanced copies of our book, which we just published. And you can see I've got my advanced copy right here in my hot little hand that covers everything and more that I just talked about today. And so if you are on Twitter and you want to give us a shout out, at UNC Press is our publisher, at NC State Hort is the folks that pay our paycheck. And our hashtag is no garden too small for pollinators. So give us a tweet, tell us what you love, tell us what you want more of, and we're going to draw 2 names out of that tweet pool, and we're going to send you guys each a book, right? We're going to give away 3. I know not everyone is on Twitter or has the interest or inclination, so if you'd still like to be in the drawing for a book, sign Mark's guest book. Mark, do you mind just dropping that in the chat? And I'm going to ask Mark or Chris to just draw a name straight out of that guest book. We're going to reach out to you. We're going to ask you for your information, and my publisher is going to send you one of my books. Lastly, if you're not comfortable with any of those things, but you still want to be in the drawing, or you just want to share something that you loved or you want more information, just drop me an email. My email is right here. You can also find me at NC State. I'm the only one with my name here, I promise. So without further ado, I'll say thank you all so much for your time. Thank you for joining us today, and go outside and plant some of those flowers, and let's feed the bees.
Fantastic. Thank you, Danesha. That was great.